Hello everyone, it's time for another Christmas story. This one's called Why the Chimes Ring by Raymond Alden. There was once in a faraway country where few people have ever traveled a wonderful church. It stood on a high hill in the midst of a great city, and every Sunday, as well on sacred days like Christmas, thousands of people climbed the hill to its great archways. When you came to the building itself, you found stone columns and dark passages and a grand entrance leading to the main room of the church. In the farthest corner, in the main hall, was the organ. And this organ was so loud that sometimes when it played, the people for miles around would close their shutters and prepare for a great thunderstorm. Altogether, no such church as this was ever seen before, especially when it was lighted up for some festival or Christmas and crowded with people, young and old. But the strangest thing about the whole building was the wonderful chime of the bells. At one corner of the church was a great gray tower with ivory growing over it as far up as one could see. I say as far up as one could see because the tower was quite great enough to fit the great church. It rose so far into the sky that you couldn't see the top. Up and up and up climbed the stones and the ivy, and as the men who built the church had been dead for hundreds of years, everyone had forgotten how high the tower was supposed to be. Now all the people knew that at the top of the tower was a chime of Christmas bells. They had hung there ever since the church had been built, and were the most beautiful bells in the world. Some described them as sounding like angels far up in the sky. But the fact was that no one had heard them for years and years. It was the custom on Christmas Eve for all the people to bring to the church their offerings to the Christ child. And when the greatest and best offering was laid on the altar, there used to come sounding the Christmas chimes far up in the tower. Some said that the wind rang them, and others that they were so high that the angels could set them swinging. But for many long years they had never been heard. It was said that people had been growing less careful of their gifts for the Christ child, and that no offering was brought great enough to deserve the music of the chimes. Every Christmas Eve, the rich people still crowded to the altar, each one trying to bring some better gift than the other, without giving anything that he wanted for himself. But although the service was splendid and the offerings plenty, only the roar of the wind could be heard far up in the stone tower. Now, a number of miles from the city, in a little country village, where nothing could be seen of the great church, but glimpses of the tower when the weather was fine, lived a boy named Pedro and his little brother. They knew very little about the Christmas chimes, but they had heard of the service in the church on Christmas Eve, and had a secret plan which they had often talked over when by themselves, to go see the beautiful celebration. The day before Christmas was bitterly cold, with a few lonely snowflakes flying in the air. Sure enough, Pedro and little brother were able to slip quietly away early in the afternoon. And although the walking was hard in the frosty air, before nightfall they had trudged so far, hand in hand, that they saw the lights of the big city just ahead of them. Indeed, they were about to enter one of the great gates in the wall that surrounded it when they saw something dark on the snow near their path, and stepped aside to look at it. It was a poor woman who had fallen just outside the city, too sick and tired to get in where she might have found shelter. The soft snow made a drift of a sort of a pillow for her, and she would soon be so sound asleep in the wintry air that no one could ever waken her again. All this Pedro saw in a moment, and he knelt down beside her and tried to rouse her, even tugging at her arm a little, as though he would have tried to carry her away. He turned her face toward him, so that he could rub some of the snow on it, and when he had looked at her silently a moment, he stood up again and said, "It's no use. Little brother, you will have to go on alone." "Alone?" cried little brother. "And you not see the Christmas festival?" "See this poor woman," said Pedro. "She will freeze to death if nobody cares for her. Everyone has gone to the church now. I will rub her to keep her from freezing, and perhaps get her to eat the bun that is left in my pocket." "But I cannot bear to leave you and go on alone," said little brother. "Both of us need not miss the service," said Pedro. "You can easily find your way to church. I am sure the Christ child must know how I should love to come with you and worship him. And oh, if you get a chance, little brother, to slip to the altar without getting in anyone's way, take this little silver piece of mine and lay it down for my offering when no one is looking." In this way he hurried little brother off to the city and winked hard to keep back the tears as he heard the crunching footsteps sounding farther and farther away in the twilight. The great church was a wonderful place that night. Everyone said it had never looked so bright and beautiful before. When the organ played and the thousands of people sang, the walls shook with the sound, and little Pedro, away outside the city wall, felt the earth tremble around them. At the close of the service came the procession with the offerings to be laid on the altar. Rich men and great women marched proudly up to lay down their gifts to the Christ child. Some brought wonderful jewels, some baskets of gold so heavy that they could scarcely carry them down the aisle. A great writer laid down a book that he had been making for years and years. And last of all walked the king of the country, hoping with all the rest to win for himself the chime of the Christmas bells. There went a great murmur through the church as the people saw the king take from his head the royal crown, all set with precious stones, and lay it gleaming on the altar as his offering to the holy child. "Surely," everyone said, "we shall hear the bells now, for nothing like this has ever happened before." But still only the cold old wind was heard in the tower. The procession was over, and the choir began the closing hymn. Suddenly the organist stopped playing, and everyone looked at the old minister who was standing by the altar, holding up his hand for silence. Not a sound could be heard from anyone in the church. But as all the people strained their ears to listen, there came softly, but distinctly, swinging through the air, the sound of the chimes in the tower. So far away and yet so clear the music seemed. So much sweeter were the notes than anything that had been heard before, rising and falling away up there in the sky, that the people in the church sat for a moment as still as though something held each of them by the shoulders. Then they all stood up together and stared straight at the altar to see what great gift had awakened the long silent bells. But all that the nearest of them saw was the childish figure of little brother, who had crept softly down the aisle when no one was looking, and had laid Pedro's little piece of silver on the altar. This Christmas, we come to celebrate Jesus. We have gifts that we know the Magi brought. We also have our own gifts, don't we, that we are going to share with one another, and it's a celebration of the birth. But I want you to remember through this story that, yes, it is right to celebrate Jesus with gifts, but what I think the story shares with us is that some of the greatest gifts are giving of ourselves. It's not the jewels. It's not the great monetary things. It's the Pedros who reach down and take care of a woman who is sick, who is cold, who needs help, who's been maybe marginalized, who's been not taken care of very well and needed shelter. And maybe we can help somebody this Christmas. Maybe we can make something nice for a neighbor who's in need. Remember Pedro this Christmas as we are celebrating the birth of Jesus. May we give gifts of ourselves and lay them at the altar of Christ. Love you all.